Right. Good morning, Year 7. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Mr. Hughes. I'm the Head of English at the Academy. And what I thought I'd do as an introduction to the work that you'll be doing with your actual English teachers is just introduce what's going on during this time, then introduce more specifically the unit of work, the scheme of work that you'll be working on for the next 6 weeks or so until half term. And then set you some project work to be doing. Thereafter, it's more likely to be that you'll be doing the work through your actual English teachers. Okay? So, we'll make a start. The unit of work we're looking at is entitled London Then and Now. And with all the work that we do in years 7, 8, 9, it's by way, if you like, of an introduction to the work that you'll be doing in a few years' time. Might seem a long way off, but these skills are things, knowledge and skills, you can build up and familiarise yourself with over a few years that you'll be needing at GCSE. Okay? So, the purpose of this work, London Then and Now. Okay? Number one is to appreciate context. Now, context is a word that we use a great deal throughout your learning in English. Context brings in many, many factors, but it's understanding that when, so what year, during which period, whatever it might be, where, why, and who wrote a particular text. Now, by a text I mean it might be a novel, it might be a poem, it might be a piece of drama, but it might be a piece of non-fiction, it might be a newspaper, it might be a poster, it might be a leaflet, it might be something on social media. So we're looking at the when, the wheres, the whys, and the whos wrote or produced a particular text, and really, really importantly, how those factors, how those ideas influence your understanding of that text. Okay? We'll also, as part of your skill, be looking to compare and contrast how texts from different times explore particular themes. So, obviously the sound of school, things go on as normal in some way. To compare and contrast how texts from different times explore a particular theme. And albeit we are going to look at things chronologically, which I'll talk about in a minute, we are going to look at London life through themes. So we're going to look at London life, the health of London, which is very, very topical at the moment. We might look at shopping and the commerce of London. We might look at crime in London, but we'll look at it at different texts from different times, exploring a particular theme. We're also looking at how writers use language to convey their ideas and to influence you as a reader, as the recipient of those texts. Okay? And actually getting into the details of how language, words, devices, structure, form, all of those things are used to impact on meaning and get those ideas across to you effectively, and sometimes ineffectively. And finally, we're going to be looking at and appreciate, hopefully, how subject content links. So obviously I'm talking at the moment, I said about chronology. Chronology is to do with time. And when we think of a subject which is focusing on time particularly, it's not necessarily English. We're more likely to be thinking about history or geography and other subjects as well. So we'll be thinking about how what we study in English links in with other subjects in what we call a cross-curricular way. Okay? And how the skills that we might use in one subject we can transfer to another subject. Now it might be skills very specific, like the project work I'm going to get you to do this week, but it might be something you look at later on as well, research skills, finding out other bits of information. And I know that one teacher in the department has already said to her group, why don't you actually go and research something else about London? And where you're going to put that, we will come to. Okay? So those are the purpose. Now, the reason why I've done this in a YouTube, in a bit of a video for you, is so that you are able to, sorry, I've just got a bit of an audience outside, so that you are able to pause this whenever you want to, and when you paused it, you also can sort of copy down, pick up some information, you can go back over it, and actually try and understand what I'm saying if you haven't first time round. Okay? So, the project work that I'm going to be asking you to do is creating a timeline. Now this can be in your exercise book, And it may just be confined to one double page. It might be much, much bigger than that. You're going to create a timeline, and that will take you probably a couple of lessons this week. You have 4 English lessons a week, one of which is going to be dedicated to you actually spending some time reading. Okay? Now, obviously as an avid reader myself, it isn't simply time that you are not doing other things. Okay? Reading is very, very important, and I could go and wax lyrical about the importance of reading, building up your vocabulary, seeing language used in a particular way, things like that. Okay? But the key thing about this is actually understanding that while you are reading, you are focusing, you're researching, but also it's giving you a bit of time, downtime as well, just to be a bit calm. Okay? We also will actually invested in that platform that you've been using called Bedrock. So it might be, if you're not actually doing just some reading of your own novel or a piece of non-fiction, that you're actually doing some work on Bedrock, and Miss MacArthur will be setting that work for the whole year group. Okay? But your other 2 or 3 lessons this week, going into next as well, I'm going to give you some project work to do here. Next week, like I said, I'll be giving out texts, and your subject teachers will be actually going through those texts with you and giving you activities to do on those texts. And having done those texts, you'll see the context of them, when they were written, who they were written by, why they were written, and so on, how they were produced, and you will integrate them, you will put them into your timeline. Okay? Just so you get an idea of where these texts come and their influences as well. Okay? So what do we mean by a timeline, that word that I've been banding around a little bit? A timeline is a representation of the chronological order in which events occurred. Now, chronological means time. Okay? So we're looking at the order in which things happen. You might know this already if you studied history and so on. It is useful to know when things happened in order to put text and resources you'll be studying into context. Now, it makes sense. Obviously, meaning, fundamental meaning of things, not just words, but entire texts, will be different if they were written 500 years ago than if they were written 5 days ago. Why? Well, because most meaning actually comes from not actually solely the person who's actually doing the production of that text, but the people actually receiving it. And you, as young people, 11, 12-year-olds in Kent in 2021, are going to be very, very different from children, let alone adults, who might have been receiving a text 400 years ago when Shakespeare was writing. Okay? I've considered, this is me, I've condensed, which means shrunk down, the history of London into 33 events. Okay? Now you might ask yourself, how old is London as a city? It's been described by my favourite writer, a man called Joseph Conrad, as the biggest and the greatest city on earth. You might ask yourself, that huge city, 20 miles or so north of here, how long has actually been a city for? Well, we will find out. But I've condensed the history of the greatest city on earth down to 33 events. As we go through text based on aspects of London life, you will put them into the timeline. A timeline which you will create over the course of your English lessons this week. So this is the instruction for you. Obviously, it'd be better if your timelines include illustrations, so pictures, and you can do those as you wish. If you have the access to something to print off pictures with, you can put them in there. If you just want to do little sort of sketches yourself, that's fine as well. But the key to it is this is something which is going to be presented, and in due course we could even do something with them and put them up on walls as displays for this scheme of work. Pictures and any other information you might wish to add. Not just the information that I'll be giving you through the course of this little presentation, but it might be additional things, little facts about London you want to put in somewhere, and where would that fact take place? So you're really thinking chronologically in terms of time. As there is lots to go on onto the timeline, you can do this over a number of double pages in your exercise books. You can either just do it across the page, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment, snaking your way down the page and so on. But considering we've got quite a lot of information to get in there, it might be a better idea if you do it across a few pages. If you want to, and you've got a long roll of paper and you want to do it like that, then of course you may, right? So, if you need to pause it on that, just to get an additional idea and more information, so you can, all right? Now, what's going to be the first event we look at? Okay, number one, very, very clearly in the corner. AD 43. So London, as a city, if you like, or where London is now, has been around for about 2,000 years. Okay? Almost 2,000 years. So AD 43, Romans under Emperor Julius Caesar, who you've probably heard of, settle in what was then called Londinium and build a bridge across the River Thames. Okay? That's going to be our first event. Pause it on that if you need to. You will be in due course. Our second event. So we go on 20 years or so, and these might be figures you've heard of. And for me, this is just breadth of information, breadth of knowledge. This is what I'm trying to give you an understanding of here. Not just dealing with texts and dealing with language as an English teacher, but just giving you a breadth of knowledge, okay, about your capital city. Okay? So, AD 61, so 20 years or so later after the Romans settled, Queen, now this word here, pronounced a couple of ways, Boudicca, Boadicea, and she was the queen of a tribe, a Celtic tribe called the Iceni, sacks London, which means takes over London, before being defeated herself. This particular statue, okay, you might ask where that is. It's right by the Houses of Parliament. If we were to zoom out from that, the Houses of Parliament would be about where you are, the River Thames running down here and so on. And that is Boudicca. Okay? Now, how would that appear on our timeline? Okay? Your timeline, like I said, can have the title of it in there, A History of London, and this might go on for beyond just your double page in your exercise book. If you want to turn a page because you haven't got enough, fine, okay? Don't cram it all in, make it legible, but the information we've got there, I've just actually taken the images, but you can do other images if you want. AD 43, Romans under Emperor Julius settle in Londinium and build a bridge across the River Thames, and there we have, going along our timeline, AD 61, Queen Boadicea sacks the city before being defeated herself, okay? And I've already given you a little additional piece of information. This statue is right by the Houses of Parliament in Westminster in London, okay? Right, so that is our number one, which you can put on there. I'll go through each of these. Number two, the third bit of information we have, and these are all great characters from British and English history. The first king of England, okay, wasn't really until the year 884. So a long time after the first two slides. So we've got a period of time that's been covered. Don't necessarily leave a gap, but 884. And this is a man called King Alfred, Alfred the Great, and he was king of a big kingdom in the south of England called Wessex. There's another kingdom called Mercia, and another kingdom called Northumbria, and a few other smaller ones dotted around. But they were essentially defeated by the Vikings, who came from Scandinavia. He beat the Vikings, and he set up his capital city in the south of England in London. And that was in the year 884. Okay, 1042, so we're progressing quite quickly here. Edward the Confessor moves his court to Westminster and starts to build a cathedral there. Not the one which is there at the moment, that wasn't built till much, much later. Okay, but that was where the consecrated ground, the holy ground, was for that cathedral, now opposite the Houses of Parliament. Okay, if you know your history at all, Edward the Confessor there, this is taken from, you can see it, Edward Rex, Edward King, was taken from a document, if you like, called the Bayeux Tapestry, which charts the 1066 invasion by the Normans, and the Norman conquest. Okay. Next one, number 5. This is a very famous London landmark, and built all that time ago, 1081, after the Norman conquest of 1066, King William I builds the Tower of London, known as the White Tower. Okay? The Normans were very much about military power, having actually taken England. Most of them were soldiers who came across. Having taken England, they built forts all around. Most of them wouldn't. This one, on the banks of the River Thames, in the capital city, was there to tell the Saxons, who they'd beaten, we're the bosses. Okay? That's in 1081. We progress then almost another century. A new stone London Bridge is built. Obviously this is a bit of a later depiction of it. We think in terms of our own mayors at the moment. Boris Johnson, believe it or not, was the mayor before being Prime Minister of London, and in 1189 the first Lord Mayor of London is elected, and that is he. 1381, much of London is destroyed after what we call the Peasants' Revolt. under what Tyler? Interestingly enough, from an English teacher's point of view, it wasn't until this time, in 1381, that the king spoke to his subjects in English. Up until then, because they were Normans, he'd spoken in French. This is when he chose to speak to his subjects in English. Okay? And like I said, we've got all this information there. I'm telling you other bits of information which you can pause and maybe write down as well. This is where we'll talk about research. But pause it, add it to your timeline. This is why it might take you maybe 2, maybe even 3 lessons to get it done properly. But pause it as you go along, copy the stuff down, get an illustration in. Number 9, 1532. So we're really progressing through our history very, very quickly now. Tudor, King Henry VIII, who you know for having his 6 wives, builds the Palace of Whitehall, which burns down in 1698. But the Palace of Whitehall, what we would know now as Westminster, House of Parliament around there, you can see how different it probably was built in the middle of the 16th century. Obviously, as an English teacher in the 16th century, we have to actually mention Shakespeare. We'll be looking at a bit of Shakespeare's London. I know it's something you've done a bit of already. But in 1588, William Shakespeare begins his dramatic career in London. Okay? Coming down from Stratford. There are lots of things probably that you know about London history that you don't know you know about. So on the 5th of November, every time we have a bonfire night and fireworks going off, you probably know, maybe you did it in primary school or anything like that, you probably know what it commemorates. But it commemorates 1605, beginning of the 17th century. Catholic Guy Fawkes attempts to blow up the Houses of Parliament and the Protestants King James I within it, to be discovered and infamously tortured and executed. Okay, 1605, Guy Fawkes attempts to blow up the Houses of Parliament, and we'll be looking at texts to do with many of these events. Pretty gruesome time. Okay, halfway through that century, we have a strange period in English history called the Interregnum period, which means between the kings. Okay, but after an English civil war, and civil war means there's people fighting, English people fighting English people, not foreign powers. After the English Civil War, which was between the Royalists, who supported the king, sometimes called the Cavaliers, and the Parliamentarians, who supported Parliament, sometimes called the Roundheads, okay? They had a war. The Roundheads, the Parliamentarians, under a man called Oliver Cromwell, won. And because he refused to go back on what he actually thought was right, King Charles I was beheaded on a cold London morning. Okay? It was so cold, in fact, that famously King Charles I put on 2 shirts. And when he was asked, why are you wearing 2 shirts, he said, because I don't want people to see me shivering and assume it's because of fear. I will be shivering because it's very, very cold, but I want to shiver as little as possible because I don't want people to think I'm scared, just before having his head chopped off. So a brave man, even if essentially he was wrong. Okay? 1649 to 1660, Puritan and Parliamentarian, Oliver Cromwell takes charge of the country. For 11 years we don't have a king or a queen. Okay, you can see here, okay, his dates, but very importantly, this man, warts and all, and he was meant to have rather a warty face, that's where that phrase comes from. That statue is outside, I guess, the Houses of Parliament, because he was a very famous parliamentarian. With a parliament, democracy if you like, people being represented, not just a few people actually running the country, but people being represented was something that he advocated, that he was very interested in. When he dies, 1660, after 11 years, the monarchy is restored under Charles II. This is known as the Restoration period, and you can see the difference in this picture. The Restoration period is meant to be a time of happiness and partying after what have been very, very difficult times for 11 years for many people under Cromwell's regime. And you can see the colour in this and the difference between the way Cromwell was. They were called the Roundheads because they had very, very short haircuts, whereas in the Restoration period, the men wore these very long wigs and flamboyant clothes and all that type of thing. But there's actually a type of comedy called Restoration comedy, because people started going back to theatres and they wanted to have a bit of fun. Okay, and that's what that was all about, this particular time. This period, 1660 to 1669, a very famous diarist, a man called Samuel Peeps, wrote a lot about London life at that time, and we'll be looking at some of his work as well, up to number 15. A lot of people thought, religious people thought, that because there was too much fun being had in the Restoration period, people were being punished. Okay? How are they being punished? Well, it's something we can sort of empathise with a bit now. 1665, we have the Great Plague, which hits London. Okay? Like I said, people thought because too much fun was being had and when people weren't worshipping God enough, those people were then being punished and a plague comes along. And this is a contemporary representation of that. We'll be looking not just at written word, we'll be looking at images as well to see what they tell us about particular times. 20% of London's population was killed in that plague. The year after that, another disaster. People thought this was because people weren't doing what they should have done as well. 1666, 666, the Great Fire of London destroys 80% of London's buildings. And we all know stories about how that started and so on, a bakery in Pudding Lane and so on, and a spark from a fire and all of that, but 80% of London's buildings. And we're going to look at some, like I said, some of Peeps' diary and actually look at the plague and look at the Great Fire as well. From the ashes of the Great Fire, about a decade later, Christopher Wren builds St Paul's Cathedral. The beginning of that our cathedral is being built. Still there. If you go to a building called the Tate Modern, there's the wobbly Millennium Bridge in between, and the other side of it is St Paul's Cathedral. An amazing structure. Okay. 1735, King George II makes 10 Downing Street. Okay. Available to England's first Prime Minister, a man called Sir Robert Walpole, and to this day is still the residence of the British PM, so where Boris Johnson does his work from at the moment. And that started all the way back in 1735. Very, very important as well to an English teacher and to you as English students. 1764, Samuel Johnson compiles the first dictionary. Until that time, we didn't have a dictionary because most people were illiterate, most people couldn't read and write. And certainly some of the definitions in the dictionary might seem a little strange. Even some of the spelling in the dictionary might seem a bit strange. There was no standard way of spelling up until this point, particularly. Okay? Even Shakespeare, going back 150 years before that, used to spell his name in different ways. Okay? Because it was to do with how it sounded, not how it looked. Obviously now we have what we call standardisation in English, so every time you get some ink in the margin saying you've spelt this wrong or you haven't used the right bit of grammar, that's because we have a standard by which we compare things to. What's next? 1829, so we're getting into quite sort of modern eras now. Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel establishes London's first police force. And you think of these and these sort of images, there's one writer which comes up that used to write so much about London, and that is Dickens, and we'll be looking at some of Dickens's work, exactly the type of thing that Peel is, okay? Or sometimes, because this man was called Sir Robert Peel, this is why we sometimes call the police the bobbies now, because this is when they started. What else do we have? 1834, the current Houses of Parliament are built. So much of the building that goes on in this period is to do with the Victorians. Amazing engineers. Even, believe it or not, there's a story that the River Thames was smelling so bad, they shut down Houses of Parliament right on the banks of the River Thames. They shut down Parliament because they couldn't actually be in there because of the odour coming from the river. And they started going through a process of actually sanitising the river. And even, if you go to actually certain places, they narrowed the river a bit, narrowed the entire river. And you can go back to where the old banks of the river used to be, and you can see where the boats used to come in and so on and so forth. But that's what the Victorians are amazing at, engineering. 1840, Nelson's Column is built in Trafalgar Square to commemorate Nelson's victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, going back to 1805 when that happened, and he beat the Napoleonic Navy in 1805 in Trafalgar. That's something we all see in London. That was built at this time in 1840. The Great Exhibition of London is opened by Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert. Okay, in Hyde Park, huge structure again, celebrating London. This is something obviously people get wrong. In 1859, a 13.5-ton bell called Big Ben is put in the clock tower. Now, since 2012, it's named the Elizabeth Tower, after our Queen Elizabeth, in the Houses of Parliament. So the actual thing which has had scaffolding around it for a couple of years now is not called Big Ben. It's called the Elizabeth Tower. The bell within it, at the Houses of Parliament, is called Big Ben. 1863, the first section of the London Underground is laid between Paddington and Farringdon, something we take a bit for granted now. One of those amazing bits of design which I could have put up there is actually the London Underground map. Stunning piece of graphic design. We'll be looking at some of this. Crime in London as well. 1880, Jack the Ripper strikes in Whitechapel. Okay, one of the most infamous and still anonymous murderers in English history. 1894, so almost getting to the 20th century now, Tower Bridge is built, which actually an American multi-millionaire, he said, I want to buy Tower Bridge, thinking that actually it was called London Bridge. So they took it apart brick by brick, sent it back to him, he reconstructed it in America, thinking it was going to be that, but in fact it was London Bridge, which was just a pretty standard bridge at the time. Okay. 1915, in World War I, German Zeppelins drop incendiary, which is ones that start fires, bombs on the city. Okay, we're going to be looking at some of the military history of London. We're going to be looking at some of the BBC original sort of transcripts. The BBC transmits its first television programmes all the way back in 1922. You'd find it hard to believe now there's so many platforms for you to get sort of programmes from, but back then it was one TV channel broadcasting very, very, very limited programmes. Even when I was a child, there were only 3 channels on TV, if you can believe that. In 1939 to 45, during World War II, German Blitz of London, the city is heavily bombed and thousands of children are evacuated. We'll be looking at not only that from non-literature texts, but from literary texts as well, like Good Night, Mr. Tom, like Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, things like that. Always got reference to that. Incidentally, that photo, very, very famous, another chap who actually took that photo. 1982, almost at the end, the Thames Barrier is completed, protecting the city from flood. And last one, 2012, the London Olympics coincide with our Queen Elizabeth's second Diamond Jubilee. Okay, so we're up to 33. I said that I'd condense that into 33 key events. Okay, so just to reiterate to you, I realise that is quite a big piece of work, but next week when we actually start trying to look at individual texts on themes and things like that, it'd just be useful for you to understand where they've come in the history of this city. So go back to number 1. If you set yourself maybe to do 10 of those each lesson, you should get up to about 33 by the time we start next week. Go back to number 1. Think about how you're going to do it. Like I said, don't cram it in too much, but maybe do 10 each double side. If you want to add in illustrations, add some colour, do whatever you want to make it as decorative as you possibly can. And like I said, as and when we start going through other texts, we can integrate those in so you get a better understanding of not just the historical and social and cultural and philosophical context of things, but trying to understand the language within them as well. Okay? Hope that's sufficient work for you to be getting on with. I wish you all very, very well. And if you do need to speak to anybody about the work, or you don't understand something, or you're worried about anything to do with the work at all, just contact your subject teacher. They'll be there available for you. When you normally have a timetabled lesson, they'll be there to have a dialogue with you about this or anything else to do with English. Do take care of yourselves, and good luck.